My father's face was a mask of crimson fury, his voice echoing across my own front lawn. "You are nothing, a disgrace. This house is ours." The words were meant to break me, just as they always had. Between us stood 2 police officers, their expressions weary. The senior one, a Sergeant Miller, looked at me, clearly expecting tears or a hysterical defense. I offered neither. I simply reached into my wallet and handed him my government identification, my hands perfectly steady. He took it with a sigh, but as his eyes scanned the card, something changed. It was a subtle shift at first. A flicker of confusion, then recognition. His back straightened, his shoulders squared, and the weariness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, sudden respect. He looked from the ID in his hand back to me, then turned to my father. His voice was no longer that of a mediator. It was firm, official steel. "Sir, you are currently harassing a commissioned officer of the United States Navy. I suggest you lower your voice and step off her property immediately." My father's mouth hung open, the words dying in his throat. The silence that followed was more damning than any shout. 5 years earlier, the setting was my parents' dining table, but it felt just as much like an ambush. I had just been laid off from a junior marketing job, and they had staged what they called an intervention. My father, David, a man obsessed with the appearance of conventional success, paced the room as he delivered his verdict on my life. "This is what happens when you don't have a real plan," he lectured, his disappointment a physical force in the room. "You're directionless, a financial liability." Beside him sat my brother Mark, the family's golden boy, who wore his charisma like a shield. He just smirked, a silent confirmation of my failure. "Dad's right," he chimed in, twisting the knife. "It's embarrassing." The memory of them co-signing Mark's loan for his last sure-thing business venture flashed through my mind, a bitter contrast to the lecture I was receiving now. They weren't offering help, they were reasserting control. "You can have your old room," my father said, the offer dripping with condescension, "until you figure out what to do with your life." Again, it wasn't a lifeline, it was a cage. He called me a liability, a failure with no future. He had no idea that being laid off wasn't an ending, but the beginning of a path he could never comprehend. To understand how my father ended up screaming on my lawn, you have to understand the life I built after they wrote me off. After I left home, I learned to live 2 lives. The first was the one my family constructed for me, a carefully maintained fiction where I was always struggling, always one step behind. In that world, my brother Mark was the star, and his every minor achievement was cause for a grand celebration. I remember the summer he was promoted to regional sales lead. My father threw a massive barbecue, the entire yard filled with neighbors and distant relatives, all gathered to witness my brother's ascent. Dad raised a glass, his voice booming with a pride he never showed me. "To my son, Mark, climbing the ladder to success." I watched him celebrate a new title on a business card as if it were a national holiday, and I felt nothing. It was just another Tuesday in the ongoing theater of my family. A few months later, I called home from my small apartment near my first duty station. I'd just gotten the news. After 3 years of night school and a grueling 3-day exam, I had officially passed the bar. When I told my mother, there was a long pause on the line. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she finally said, her voice distant and distracted. I could hear the television in the background. "Are you still doing that little government paralegal thing?" The words landed like tiny shards of glass. 3 years of my life, the mountains of debt I'd taken on, the countless nights I'd spent studying until my eyes burned. All of it, reduced to a little thing. That was their specialty, making my victories so small you could barely see them. They referred to my service in the Navy as my hobby, like it was a book club or a pottery class. When I used my VA loan to buy my first house, a modest 2-bedroom bungalow, they came to visit and walked through it with thinly veiled pity. "It's a good starter home," my father declared, patting a wall as if checking its integrity. "A bit small, but it's a start." They openly speculated about whether I could handle the mortgage, the same way they'd always questioned if I could handle my own life. I remember thinking of the thousands of dollars they'd given Mark for his failed cryptocurrency venture last year, no questions asked. The internal ledger in my mind just kept ticking. Their endless faith in his failures, and their constant doubt in my successes. They needed me to be their project, the one who was perpetually in need of their guidance, because the alternative that I was building a life entirely without them, was something their narrative couldn't handle. My other life, my real life, was a world away from those backyard barbecues. It existed in the quiet, sterile confines of secure government buildings at Naval Station Norfolk. There, I wasn't poor, directionless Anya. I was Lieutenant Commander Sharma, an operational law attorney for the United States Navy. My days weren't filled with family drama, but with high-stakes decisions that had international consequences. I remember one particular morning, standing in a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility, briefing a ship's captain before his vessel entered a contested waterway. The air was thick with tension, the fate of 200 sailors hanging on the counsel I provided. I wasn't a paralegal. I was the one advising command on the rules of engagement for a strait, transit, outlining the legal implications of the UCMJ in a joint operational area. There was no room for error. There was no room for doubt. In that world, respect wasn't given, it was earned. And I had earned it. My commanding officer was Captain Eva Rostova, a stern but scrupulously fair leader who saw competence, not family history. After that tense briefing, she called me into her office. She looked at me from across her steel desk and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Your counsel kept my sailors out of an international incident today, Commander," she said, her voice low but firm. Well done. Hearing those two words from her, it felt more real, more validating than 1,000 of my father's hollow toasts for my brother. That was my reality, a world of immense responsibility and quiet professional respect. It was a world my family couldn't even begin to comprehend. The two lives rarely intersected, but when they did, it was usually through a phone call from my mother. Carol, a woman who treated family peace like a religion, even if it was built on a foundation of lies. She'd call me after my father had a bad week at his failing business. "Your father is just worried," she'd say in a soft, pleading voice. "You know how he is about appearances. When you come home for Christmas, maybe just don't mention your work too much. All those acronyms and things, it just confuses him." I was being asked yet again to shrink myself to protect his fragile ego. I was the family shock absorber, expected to be small so he could feel big. It was a role I had played my entire life. For years, I compartmentalized. I was LCDR Sharma at work, and poor directionless Anya at home. It was easier than fighting their narrative. But when their world collapsed, they decided my reality was theirs for the taking, and I knew the time for compartments was over. The call came on a Tuesday. I saw my father's name on the screen and felt that old, familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I answered, and there was no preamble, no small talk. His business had finally gone bankrupt, and they'd lost their house. But this wasn't a call for help. It was a declaration. "We're moving in with you next Saturday," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of any doubt. "We've already rented the U-Haul. Mark will take the master bedroom since he needs a proper office. It's the least you can do after we supported you all those years." For a moment, I was speechless. The sheer, breathtaking entitlement of it all. Claiming my master bedroom for the golden child, erasing me in my own home. The years of quiet injustices, the constant belittling, the deliberate blindness. To my life, it all coalesced into a single clarifying point of rage. But then, something else took over. A cold, quiet calm washed away the anger. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't argue. I would not engage in an emotional fight I was programmed to lose. I would engage in a legal one. A fight they couldn't possibly win. After I hung up, I went to my home office. There would be no more pleading to be seen. From this moment on, there would only be facts and jurisdiction. I spent the next hour preparing my defense. The hum of my printer was the only sound as I compiled my case file. I printed the deed to my house, with my name, and my name alone, on every page. I printed the last 5 years of my mortgage history, a flawless record of my own financial independence. Then, I printed out the state's penal code on criminal trespass and harassment, highlighting the relevant sections with a yellow marker. I even pulled up the Service Members Civil Relief Act, the SGRA, just to remind myself of the legal world I inhabited, a world with rules they couldn't bend. This wasn't just paper. This was my armor. The final step was the most crucial. I picked up the phone and dialed the local police department's non-emergency line. My voice was level, my tone professional, the same one I used when briefing a superior officer. "Good afternoon," I began, This is Lieutenant Commander Anya Sharma, U.S. Navy. I am an active duty service member residing at 123 Oak Street. I am calling to provide a courtesy notification that I expect a hostile attempt by estranged family members to illegally occupy my residence this coming Saturday. I wanted the watch commander to have a preemptive record of the situation. In that single procedural move, I had changed the entire nature of the coming conflict. I wasn't just a daughter. I was a credible source, an officer, and I was setting the battlefield. They had rented a U-Haul. I had built a case file. They thought they were coming to an intervention. They had no idea they were walking into a legal jurisdiction they didn't know existed. Saturday morning arrived, quiet and bright, but a low rumble soon disturbed the peace of the neighborhood. The U-Haul. It pulled up to the curb exactly as they said it would, a monstrous orange and white symbol of their entitlement. The truck's brakes hissed, and the cab doors slammed shut. My father, my mother, and my brother Mark got out, not with the hesitation of guests, but with the arrogant assurance of conquerors. They immediately started unloading boxes, stacking them on my pristine lawn as if it were a public loading dock. I saw the curtains twitch in the houses across the street. My private humiliation was now a public spectacle. They weren't just invading my home. They were putting on a performance for the whole world, to see a show where they were the aggrieved parents, and I, the ungrateful child. I took a final, steadying breath and opened my front door. I had just returned from a formal change of command ceremony on base, and I hadn't changed. I stood there, framed in the doorway, wearing my immaculate Navy service dress blue uniform. The dark wool was sharply creased, the gold buttons gleamed, and the rows of colored ribbons on my chest told the story of a life they had willfully ignored. It wasn't a costume. It was a statement of fact, a reality I was forcing them to confront. My father saw me and let out a short, barking laugh. "What is this, a costume party?" He sneered, his eyes filled with contempt. "Stop playing games, Anya. Get the door and help with these boxes." He saw the uniform, but he couldn't see me. He couldn't comprehend the oath that came with it. I remained in the doorway, a calm, immovable object blocking their path. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the authority he refused to see. "You are on private property," I said, my words precise and devoid of emotion. "You have been instructed not to be here. I am ordering you to leave now." The legalistic language, the formal order, it was a language he didn't know how to fight. His face contorted with rage, the color rising in his cheeks. He took a threatening step forward, his voice a bellow that echoed down the quiet street. "We are your family. You owe us. This house, this life, it should have been Mark's." And that was it. That was the moment he crossed the line. With deliberate calm, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The police arrived in minutes, 2 cruisers rolling to a stop. Sergeant Miller stepped out, the same officer from the Hook, his face set in a look of professional patience. Before he could even speak, my father rushed toward him, launching into the performance of his life. He was the victim, the heartbroken father being cast out by his cruel, unstable daughter. He painted a picture of my ingratitude, of his own generosity, his voice thick with false emotion. I stood on my porch, silent and motionless. I let him speak. I let him spin his entire web of lies. My silence was a strategy. Every word he spoke was another shovel of dirt on the grave he was digging for himself. When his tirade finally sputtered out, I waited a beat, then looked directly at Sergeant Miller. "Sir?" I said calmly. "May I present my identification?" I walked down the steps and handed him my military ID. This was the moment. I watched his eyes scan the card. I saw the slight frown of confusion, the way his gaze darted from the photo to my face, then back to the text. I saw the instant the letters registered in his brain. LCDR. Judge Advocate General's Corps. His entire body changed. His posture, which had been the relaxed stance of a cop at a domestic dispute, snapped into a subtle version of attention. He remembered the courtesy call. He saw the uniform. It all clicked into place. He looked at me with a new understanding, not as a daughter in a family squabble, but as a fellow professional, a senior officer. He handed the ID back to me with a respectful nod. Then, he turned to my father. His voice was different now. It was stripped of all warmth, all attempt at mediation. It was the flat, commanding tone of the law. "Mr. Sharma," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn, "you and your family will cease all activity, remove your vehicle and belongings. From this property, and have no further contact with the commander. If you return, you will be arrested. This is your only warning." The word hung in the air, a sonic boom that shattered their entire world. "Commander." The color drained from my father's face. He stared, his mouth agape, as if the officer had spoken in a foreign language. My brother Mark looked pale, his smirk finally gone, replaced by the wide-eyed look of a child who just realized the adults are truly angry. And my mother simply began to cry, quiet, broken sobs of a woman watching her carefully constructed reality crumble into dust on a public street. The neighbors were all watching. They saw it all. My father had spent my whole life telling me I needed to respect his authority. In the end, it was a stranger in a police uniform who taught him the true meaning of the word. There was no shouting as they left. The silence was far heavier. Under the watchful eyes of the entire neighborhood and the silent authority of the police, my family loaded their boxes back into the U-Haul. Each scrape of cardboard on the truck's ramp felt like a final, grinding admission of defeat. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at each other. They just moved with a grim, humiliated efficiency. My father's face was a pale, slack mask. My brother seemed to shrink with every box he lifted. My mother's tears had dried, leaving only a hollowed-out emptiness in her eyes. When the last box was loaded, they climbed into the cab without a word, and the truck rumbled away, leaving only silence in its wake. As the police cars pulled away, a man walked out from the house across the street. He was older, with lines on his face that spoke of a long and difficult life, and he wore a faded cap that read Vietnam Veteran. He walked to the edge of my lawn, stopped, and looked at me. He didn't offer any words of sympathy or congratulations. He simply stood a bit straighter and raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken understanding, a sign of respect from one service member to another. I returned it with a nod, my throat tight. In that silent exchange, I received all the validation I had ever needed. That single moment from a stranger held more genuine respect than I had ever received from my own father. A year passed. A year of quiet, of peace, of building. My life was no longer defined by what I had to defend, but by what I was able to create. I stood in a briefing room, a laser pointer in my hand, guiding a group of bright, sharp-eyed junior officers through a complex legal problem. The plaque on the door outside read, LCDR a Sharma, Staff Judge Advocate. I had been promoted into a leadership position, entrusted with mentoring the next generation of Navy lawyers. My home was no longer a fortress, it was a sanctuary. The walls were filled with photographs, but not of my biological family. There were pictures of my team, grinning after a successful case, a shot of me with Captain Rostova on the deck, of a destroyer, photos from deployments, from holidays spent with the friends who had become my real family. I heard about them, of course. News trickles down through the grapevine of distant relatives. A cousin called one day, her voice hesitant, to tell me they were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment 3 states away. She also told me my father had been served with a formal military restraining order. After the incident on my lawn, he had tried to contact my commanding officer directly, to complain, an old bullying tactic from a world where he was in charge. But in my world, that was considered harassment of a commissioned officer. He had tried to use his parental authority in a place where the only authority that matters is rank and regulation, and he learned the hard way that he had none. The news didn't bring me joy, just a quiet sense of an equation finally being balanced. The final test came 6 months after that. An email appeared in my inbox, the sender's name, Mark Sharma, making my stomach clench for just a second. The message was a long, rambling mess of excuses and apologies that weren't really apologies. It was a masterpiece of learned helplessness. It ended with the line I knew was coming, the final desperate attempt to pull me back into their orbit. "Dad is sick," he wrote. "He needs help. You were always the strong one." I read the words, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, but a vast calm distance. My strength was not a family utility. It was not a resource for them to drain whenever their own poor choices caught up to them. It was mine. I moved my cursor over the message. For a brief second, it hovered over the reply button. Then, with a decisive click, I moved it to archive. The message vanished. I took a sip of my coffee and turned my attention back to the legal brief on my screen. My work. My life. My family believed a legacy was the house you lived in. I learned a true legacy is the code you live by and the uniform you earn to defend it. If you've ever had to enforce a boundary to protect the life you built, share your story below. In this community, your strength is always recognized.